For the past 4 months, I've been monitoring carbon dioxide in my environment, and I want to know, is this actually helpful and good for our health, or is this just a waste of time? Let's find out. This video is sponsored by Element. Hey guys, it's Robin, and welcome to the Science of Self-Care, where we fall in love with the practice of taking care of ourselves so we can live better, longer. I'm very excited for this video because I have been hearing a lot about monitoring CO2 in our environment, in our home, in our workplace, and proponents of doing so believe that it can help our productivity, help our sleep, and our overall health. So I really wanted to investigate those claims in this video. Part 1 is going to be going over some carbon dioxide monitoring research, and then part 2 is going to be my personal experience using a carbon dioxide monitor for 4 months, taking that around with me in my home, but also in other places like an airplane. I might have overdone it a little bit, but we are going to get into all of that. So if you have been curious how carbon dioxide in your air might be affecting your health or your sleep or your productivity, then keep watching. Part 1, the research on ambient CO2 levels. First off, why would we want to measure carbon dioxide? Well, just a little refresher, we humans breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. So measuring carbon dioxide in our surroundings, especially over time, can tell us if the ventilation in that space is keeping up with its occupancy. So for example, let's say you have 4 people over for dinner in your dining room and you have a little monitor in the corner. If by the end of the evening, the carbon dioxide levels have continued to rise with those 4 people sitting there, that's a sign that the airflow and the ventilation in that space has not been sufficient to keep up with all the carbon dioxide that those 4 humans are breathing out in your dining room. So even though most at-home carbon dioxide monitors do not measure oxygen, they don't measure other things related to air quality like VOCs, nitric dioxide from a gas stove, or formaldehyde, mold, all of these other things that tell us about indoor air quality, they do tell us about ventilation, and that can be a helpful thing to note because if we realize that a space that we're living in or spending a lot of time in is not well ventilated, well then we can do something about it, whether that means installing better ventilation systems, opening up doors or windows, or just being cognizant of how many people are in a space at a single time. So this chart gives a pretty good idea of the different CO2 levels. 400 to 600 parts per million is very similar to how it is outdoors, which is ideal. And then anywhere between 600 and 1,000 parts per million, you're still in a pretty good range. But if you start to see levels above 1,000 parts per million, even above 1,500, then you want to make sure you are figuring out better ways to ventilate this space because it could be influencing your sleep, your cognition, your comfort. There are some studies related to carbon dioxide levels and productivity. Now, interestingly, there is a distinction in these studies. Some studies are just looking at carbon dioxide as a proxy for air ventilation, which is different than studies that add carbon dioxide to an environment. So in one case, the changing levels of carbon dioxide will usually be also related to changing levels of other airborne compounds because it's more a reflection of the overall ventilation. And in the other case, it's just measuring the pure effect of carbon dioxide. And interestingly, it seems like carbon dioxide itself might not be such an issue, but that measuring carbon dioxide can be a great way to understand the ventilation in a space, which if you are spending a lot of time in a poorly ventilated space, that can have negative effects on productivity and sleep. One of the most well-cited studies is Satish et al. 2012, where participants were exposed to carbon dioxide levels of 600, 1,000, and 2,500 parts per million for 2.5 hours, and in that time they completed complex decision-making tasks. Performance declined on several domains at 1,000 parts per million and especially at 2,500 parts per million. But the study size was quite small, only 22 participants, so these results should be taken with a grain of salt. Zhang and colleagues did especially useful work because they tried to separate pure carbon dioxide from the broader cocktail of low ventilation indoor air. So to better understand this, I want to share a quick note on bioeffluents. Humans actually emit a cloud of compounds through our breath, our skin, sweat, clothing, our microbiome activity. These are things like acetone, isoprene, aldehydes, ammonia-like compounds, our skin oils, odor, moisture, and many other volatile compounds that can collect in the air around us in addition to the actual carbon dioxide that we breathe out. So in this study, they exposed participants to conditions around 500, 1,000, or 3,000 parts per million, either by adding pure carbon dioxide to reach those levels, or by reducing ventilation so that the carbon dioxide accumulated along with human bioeffluents. And the pure CO2 condition was much less clearly harmful, while the bioeffluent-rich low ventilation condition produced more symptoms and some cognitive performance effects. So really, this is one of the most interesting debated takeaways, that carbon dioxide itself may not necessarily be the villain, but it's usually a sign that other things in the air, if it's rising, are also rising. So if on your carbon dioxide monitor you see a very high level like 1,800 parts per million, this should raise questions like, why is so much exhaled air being accumulated, and what else is accumulating with that exhaled air, and how can I improve the ventilation in this space? A 2023 systematic review and meta-analysis looked across short-term exposure studies and concluded that complex cognitive tasks were more consistently affected by indoor relevant CO2 levels. So this means truly deep work tasks where you're thinking, strategizing, planning, and not necessarily quick reaction time or kind of reflex type tasks. So for me, my takeaway is that if I am doing deep work, I'm filming or editing or writing something, and I want to be as mentally sharp as possible, I would rather be closer to 600 to 800 parts per million than sitting for several hours at 1,500 parts per million. So even if you don't have a carbon dioxide monitor yourself, you can do little tests where you try working with, for example, the windows closed versus the windows open. How does that make you feel? And it's been interesting to now see with this carbon dioxide monitor how much CO2 levels can fluctuate just by opening doors and windows. Okay, so that's our productivity. What about our sleep? There is a bedroom study where average overnight carbon dioxide around 1,000 to 1,300 parts per million was associated with slightly reduced sleep efficiency compared to around 750 parts per million. And that night of poor sleep was followed by worse cognitive performance the next day. So all in all, it does seem like there are actual benefits to tracking CO2 a little more consciously. I'd like to take a quick moment to share the sponsor of today's video, Element Electrolytes. Currently, my husband and I have been on our Element game because we are doing 75 Hard, which is a mental and fitness challenge that involves doing 2 workouts a day, as well as drinking a gallon of water a day, among many other things. And we truly wouldn't be able to do this challenge without Element because it allows us to recover quickly from our workouts and be ready to do the next one. Very excitingly, Element has just come out with a new flavor, pink lemonade, which is actually my favorite flavor to date. It's tangy, it's sweet, a little salty, and it's also pink. The color comes from raspberry powder. It's a super fun touch, and in my opinion, Element has the most delicious electrolytes on the market. Because they're so delicious, I have this Pavlovian association with wanting to work out because I get to drink a very delicious drink. So to me, it's a form of positive reinforcement. If you are someone who does a lot of intense workouts, a lot of saunaing, and are looking to replenish electrolytes, I can highly recommend Element. Right now, they are offering a free sample pack with any Element order when you shop through this link, drinkelement.com/selfcare, or use this QR code here on screen. Now let's get back to all things CO2 monitoring. Part 2, my personal experience monitoring carbon dioxide. So this is the device that I have been using for the past 4 months. This is the SAF Aranet4 Home. Again, this device only measures carbon dioxide, not oxygen. It also measures temperature and humidity, but I've mainly been using it to track carbon dioxide in places that I'm spending a lot of time, but also just places that I've been traveling around to. When I first got this monitor, I was super excited to just test everywhere and everything. And when I first got the package containing this monitor, I immediately opened it. I was actually visiting my father at the time, and I was sitting in his kitchen area. That is quite an open space, and I would say, from the looks of it, very well ventilated. So I was pretty perplexed when right out of the box, it was measuring over 1,000 parts per million CO2. And then when I would quickly step outside in his backyard, it would immediately drop to the 500s. And so I was very curious why it was so much higher in this seemingly wide open, well-ventilated space where I was sitting alone, so it wasn't as if there were a lot of bodies breathing in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide. Well, lo and behold, my dad came in and discovered that there was a pillow over the ventilation system in the kitchen, and I think it had just fallen there on accident, and after we removed that pillow, the levels immediately dropped, and that was pretty cool to see that this device was actually alerting me to a blocked ventilation issue CO2 that I wasn't even aware of. I soon after took it with me on an airplane where I was expecting the carbon dioxide levels to slowly rise over the course of the flight. And to my surprise, it actually didn't, which makes me feel like airplanes are relatively well ventilated because the levels were pretty consistent over the course of the flight, even with hundreds of bodies in the plane. And actually the levels were worse when we were on the ground taxiing, and that's also when it smelled a lot like jet fuel. So I don't know if those things are related, but it was cool to see that the levels didn't change too much over the course of a flight. Also, in the first month of using this, I took it with me to different cafes where I would work, trying to find different places that seemed to have lower levels of CO2. But I think I quickly realized that it's a little bit silly to take this device everywhere you go because you don't always have direct control over the ventilation in a space. And so it's not that useful if you take this into, for example, a grocery store or some sort of shop where you're only going to spend a small portion of time. That's not really helpful. It can create extra anxieties about carbon dioxide levels in different places, especially if you don't have any control over the air or the ventilation in that space. I think it's just unnecessary extra information. However, where this device has been extremely useful has been at home, and specifically where my husband and I use it every single day, or I should say every single evening, is in our bedroom. I share a relatively small bedroom with my husband and my baby, so there are 3 of us humans breathing the air in this small space. And since using this device, we've gotten a lot better about making sure all the doors are open. So there's 2 doors to this room, and then also making sure both of the windows are open. And since making these adjustments, we can get the parts per million pretty close to outside levels. Before being conscious about this, that room would sometimes be in the thousands. In addition to improving our sleep environment, we've also used this in our office space. And again, it's just created the habit of opening doors and windows as much as possible. I'm actually usually filming these videos with all doors and windows closed because I live in a very noisy area with trains and traffic, but I'm trying to film this with the windows and doors open just for the sake of this video. But when I do film with everything shut, even though the sound is a little better, I do notice that after a while of filming, I think it's a little bit harder to find my words. I feel a little bit more mentally fatigued a little more quickly. So I don't know if it's a complete placebo, but I do feel like I can film for longer when my doors and windows are open. Something small I've noticed. Some best practices if you are using a monitor is to make sure you're putting it at the approximate level where your head will be. So in our bedroom, that's going to be a little bit lower because we're sleeping, but at our desk, it might be a little higher. CO2 levels can be very different on the ground or, at the 7-foot height of a ceiling. So that's just something to keep in mind to get a useful reading from these monitors. It's also important to note that there is a margin of error. I think my device has about a 30 parts per million margin of error. And so it's helpful not to become too obsessed about these very specific numbers, but rather just be studying the general trends in the spaces where you spend a lot of time. And if you notice that the levels are consistently above 1,000 parts per million, there could be some room for improvement in terms of ventilation. Now, do I think the price of this is worth it? I know I spent over $100. I'm going to put the exact price I spent on this monitor here. I think it's quite pricey, but considering it brings us a lot of peace of mind every single evening that we go to sleep, I think it's been worth it. I love using it in our bedroom, especially with our baby. It just makes me more confident that the air is well ventilated. And if I see these CO2 levels are especially high, I can do something about it. For example, we typically have a blackout curtain down, but if we're going to bed and the levels are especially high, then I will just not even have any curtains down to really get the air flowing as much as possible. So I love being able to reference this every single evening. But truly, if you're on a budget, I think the biggest takeaways I could have come up with without measuring CO2, it's just to be opening doors and windows as much as possible and to make sure spaces are well ventilated, the air is circulating, and in theory you don't need a monitor to do that. And funnily enough, this is a point that a microplastics expert also made when I was interviewing her for a coming episode. Unfortunately, the audio of that interview got completely screwed up, so I haven't released the interview and I'm not sure if I will. But one of her main points was that actually one of the biggest indoor air pollutants is microplastic fibers, tiny microplastic fibers that come from synthetic fabrics like nylon, acrylic, polyester. And these fibers we can breathe in and they can irritate our lungs. And this is especially risky for children who can develop increased risks for asthma if they're living in spaces with a lot of tiny microplastic particles. So I think looking back on these 4 months, also including this interview that I did, just make sure you open your doors and windows when you are able to. And if you aren't able to just make sure that the ventilation system is operating properly. I remember I lived in a dorm room many years ago, and it often smelled like cigarette smoke in my room, even though I'm not a smoker, because the person next door was smoking. Clearly, this ventilation system was not doing a good job of giving me clean air. It was just very much recycled air from my neighbor. So those sorts of concerns are very valid points to bring up if you do live in some shared apartment complex. As always, I have been talking for so long, and I really want to hear from you guys. Have you ever measured the CO2 in your home spaces? Do you measure other things in your indoor air? Please share with us down below. I love hearing from you guys, and I know you guys learn so much from each other. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.